Okay, so we're gonna get started. Hi, my name is Jeff Montezioca. I'm the professor over in the sociology department, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Alice Echols. Before I introduce her, I just, gotta plug the sponsors. So, this event is sponsored by the Colorado Center for Policy Studies, the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual, the Department of Political Science, the Daniels Fund Ethic Initiative at UCCS, and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. So our speaker today, Alice Echols, she is a professor of history and the Barbara Streisand Chair of Contemporary Gender Studies at the University of Southern California, which just happens to be my alma mater, so there's a little bit of a connection there. She's written 4 books that explore the culture and politics of the long 1960s, including Hot Stuff, love that song, Disco and the Remaking of American Culture. Today she's going to talk about her 5th book, Shortfall, Family Secrets, Financial Collapse, and a Hidden History of American Banking, that focuses on a devastating but long-forgotten Depression-era banking scandal here in Colorado Springs. And it's a scandal in which her grandfather was the central character, which is kind of amazing. One of the things that strikes me looking at her work is that she tends to focus on themes of promise, contradiction, and paradox, whether she's describing disco or Janis Joplin or financial corruption. So without further ado, let's welcome Alice Echols.
Thank you for that introduction. Now, can everybody hear me? Okay. Yeah. Sure? No. No?
I'm not sure it's
No?
on. I'm not sure it's on. It sounds like
Is it any better now? No? I used to be a DJ. That's how I came to write a book about disco. I mean, it should be on now, right? Okay, great to be here. Thank you to Jeffrey. Thank you also to Liz, who did a lot of the administrative work around this too. It's wonderful to be in Colorado Springs. This is the 3rd time that I've presented on this book in Colorado Springs. Once at the event at Pikes Peak Public Library, actually 2 events there, and now here. What a great campus, and what a great room, and what a great view. You're very lucky to have this. It's terrific. So I'm here to talk about Shortfall, which came out in October. And Shortfall offers readers what I call a braided history. Okay, it's a financial history on the one hand. It's a community study of this place, Colorado Springs, and it's also a family history. It's a history of the maternal wing of my family. The very most central braid of this book concerns the building and loan industry during the interwar years between World War I and World War II. Now, when I say building and loan business, people, you get the eyes glaze over. It's like building and loan business. Because, it's been defunct for a very long time. But you have to understand that it was once a really vital part of America's financial landscape. B&Ls, as I will be calling them, building and loans, B&Ls, were actually meant to enable working class home ownership. They were meant to be vehicles of working class empowerment. They were originally known as poor men's banks, and they were democratically run cooperatives. They were run by and for their membership. And very often in the very early years, when we're talking like the 1830s and 40s in this country, very often they didn't even have offices, formal offices. And they were a part of what historians call the cooperative movement. Another piece of that would have been the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor actually ran about 12 building and loans at the height of their influence. Now, this book uncovers a largely hidden chapter in the history of American capitalism, and that is the cratering of the building and loan business during the Depression years, during the 1930s. And I tell that story in microcosm by focusing on the firestorm that enveloped this town, Colorado Springs, when all 4 of its building and loans collapsed. Something to know, very high rate of membership in building and loans in this particular community. In the early 30s, had about 10,000 heads of household. Between 5,000 and 6,000 had some relationship to a B&L, right? They either had their mortgage through it, they were depositing in a B&L, so heavily subscribed in this particular town. This is a book that looks at the scandal, as I said, that envelops Colorado Springs, but it also asks bigger questions. And I will hint at that towards the end of the talk. Bigger questions in part about how the changing realities of home ownership in America over the course of the 19th century into the 20th, and by that I mean just how you actually went about buying a home, how that has changed, and especially since the heyday of B&Ls in the 1870s, say, and how that may have political repercussions. Now, most Americans, I think it's fair to say, if they know anything about building and loans, they have heard about it because of this movie, right? This is a movie that was released in '46. It was done by Frank Capra, the famous Hollywood filmmaker, starring Jimmy Stewart as George Bailey. It was something of a flop, actually, although it became a hit many years later because it fell out of copyright. And because it fell out of copyright, many of you are younger, and so you haven't had this experience, but those of you who are my age or around it remember turning on the TV during the holiday season, and this thing was always on, right? It was just always playing. Now, so mostly if people have even heard of a B&L, it's because of this 1946 movie. And of course, by now it's classic, it's legendary. Many of you, well, let me ask you, how many of you have seen it, or at least seen a portion of it? Okay. Well, I will explain. In this slide, what's happening is that this is George Bailey. He runs the town's building and loan. Bailey Brothers Building and Loan. This is his wife, Mary, played by Donna Reed. What do you think's happening here? Why does he have a big wad of bills?
There's a run on the bank?
There's a run on the bank. In point of fact, what happens in the movie is that poor beleaguered George Bailey and Mary, and they are indeed beleaguered. They're kind-hearted, generous people, right? They really embody in many ways the ideal of a building and loan operator. This is how it's supposed to work, right? He's trying to help the working people of his hometown. They're on their way out of town for their honeymoon. The taxi cab driver says, "Gee, George, I think there's a bank run at your establishment." So he turns around. Lo and behold, there are lines of people, right, trying to get their money out. So he dashes across the street. Mary follows with the honeymoon money. And first he tries to talk reason to the depositors. He tries to say, listen, it doesn't work like a bank, right? Well, they're not really buying it or feeling it, right? And so ultimately, to cut to the chase, he ends up passing out their honeymoon money to satisfy the depositors so they don't try to, in fact, take actions in ways that would undermine the solidity of the building and loan. And this is meant to be June 32. There's actually a newspaper that shows that. It's a Wonderful Life offers what I would call a kind of fairy tale version of capitalism. And for reasons probably best known to the fleet of screenwriters who worked on it, and believe me, there were a lot of screenwriters who worked on this movie, including Clifford Odets. For some reason, a B&L became the face of this fairy tale version. Now, this is another couple. This is Walter Davis and Lula Davis. And these are my maternal grandparents. I never knew them, died long before I was born. It's fair to say that my grandparents would probably not have distributed their honeymoon money, even if there were desperate depositors banging down their door. And I think you might get a sense of that from that photograph. I mean, we aren't talking George and Mary Bailey. And one of the things I really enjoyed doing in the book is writing about the photographs and the ways in which, in particular, my grandfather would pose himself, because he almost always posed himself in ways that made him look like he would, bite your head off, right? Foreclose on your home, which he in fact did do. Move to another slide. This is indeed June 1932. This is what the Gazette looked like. And here it says, Walter Davis and 1 million are missing. It turns out at the end of the day, it's 1.25 million. And indeed, Walter Davis becomes briefly famous, especially famous in Colorado and especially famous here in this town. But he becomes famous all across the nation. It's quite a lot of money. I mean, 1.25 million translates into about 22 million today. And what happens to him is that he knows, because building and loans by June of 32, and I'm going to go back to the beginning of the building and loan failures in town, but I'm starting with the dramatic stuff first. June 32, he knows, and many people know, that the building and loan industry is failing. He decides he's going to get out of Dodge before he can be arrested. And so, June 32, he goes on the lam, and he takes the key to the safety deposit box with him, right? So, it takes them forever to open up the safety deposit box and discover that there's just nothing there to speak of. He goes on the lam. He goes to New York, where his wife, let's just go back and look at her. And I have to say, I loved writing about Lula. She's a very interesting character. Grew up an orphan in a tubercular hollow in Indiana. Very, very poor. You wouldn't know it really from that picture. But in June of 32, she's been staying at the Waldorf Astoria for several weeks. This is the middle of a depression, right? The Waldorf Astoria is one of the most exclusive, expensive hotels in New York, and even though they bargained for a cut rate, or a bit of a cut rate, because it was, after all, the Depression, it was still a lot of money. So he goes and meets her, and then she is forced back to Colorado Springs, because when she tries to tell the newspaper journalists that she's not the wife of that Walter Davis, they don't buy it. So she's forced back to Colorado Springs. Meanwhile, he stays on the lam. But here's the thing. This becomes more difficult because depositors put together money for this circular. And the city, I can't remember now if it's a city, so don't quote me on this, but money is gathered. They get together an $1,000 reward. And the detail on this is remarkable in describing what he looked like, how he behaved, the number of apples he would eat during a day. I mean, it is remarkable detail. You know, he's going to stand, he's going to walk a certain way, and probably he will look anxious. Well, guess what? In October of 1932, he's staying in Gramercy Park, at a hotel in Gramercy Park in New York City. And people who stayed in those hotels or apartment buildings had access to the Gramercy Park, which is a private park. Well, but not to detectives, probably. And there were detectives one day strolling through Gramercy Park, and they see this guy. And this guy keeps turning around, looking over his shoulder. And according to the detectives who were interviewed later, one of them turns to the other and says basically something like, something's up with him, right? Something's not right about this guy. Well, lo and behold, a few weeks later, they're leafing through, as detectives once did, a copy of True Detective magazine. This is true. They come across this, and it's like, that's him. He is a criminal. So they start to stake out Gramercy Park. And they find him, and they arrest him. And it's just before Christmas, right? And they arrest him, and they put him into jail. I'm not going to tell you what happens right now. We're going to hold that for a little bit. I will say, however, they let him into his jail cell wearing his suit and his silk tie, out of deference to the fact that he is a banker, or perhaps because he slipped them some money. Who knows? So what I discovered was it took me quite a while to sort of figure out the family story, right? That, and I was very lucky because of a family archive that I'll talk about in a moment. I did a lot of research both here in Colorado Springs and in Denver, particularly at the Colorado State Archives. If you're doing a financial history, a financial scandal in Colorado, you're really going to want to go to Denver for the state archives because of the court records there. You can find out a tremendous amount from those court records. And what I discovered, because I began to look more broadly, and the other thing that happened over the course of the many years that I worked on this book was that many more records became available online, and many more newspapers became available online. And what I discovered at the end of the day was that the building and loan industry was very much a hodgepodge. It varied enormously from state to state. But in most states, it was really virtually unregulated. There would be a commissioner who was meant to regulate it, but this person really was usually not doing his job, usually not even funded in a way that would have allowed him to effectively do his job. And as a result of the lax regulation, the industry was rife with corruption. There were two waves of corruption. The first wave happens in the 19th century, begins in the 1880s. When big mega associations start to form. And it's called the Nationals. These were the Nationals. And so they would, let's say there'd be a big office in Cleveland, and then there would be satellite offices. You know, it could be many states away even. And that crisis was so bad that it almost killed the building and loan industry. The second wave of corruption happened in the 1920s, when unscrupulous characters like my grandfather, who was a former loan shark, it's true, hijacked the industry for their own purposes. Their associations were not democratic cooperatives, but for-profit corporations, which they used effectively as honeypots. You know, they lined their own pockets. And the consequences were quite calamitous for people who did business with them. This happened, by the way, even in Main Street building and loans. And all four of the building and loans in Colorado Springs that I'm going to be talking about in detail were Main Street building and loans. And I think a lot of the people who did business with these B&L operators assumed that because they were proximate, they had some proximity to them, right? They went to the same churches, et cetera, that they wouldn't be ripping them off. But that's not true. And I certainly in the court records found, really chilling evidence of what my grandfather would say to men with money whom he wanted to have them park their money at his association. He would represent his building and loan as a bank, and that was what many of these people did. They said, oh, no. Really, yes, I know it's called a building and loan, but it's really a bank. And that's where these passbooks came into play, because the passbooks created the impression that it was a bank and that you were a depositor. And I always thought that, imagine, it's June of 32, you can't get your money. And look at that, which suggests, there's going to be a pot of money at the end of all of it. Ha, ha, ha. So these passbooks, the effort to fudge the difference between the kind of institution that they were running and a normal bank, that was not unusual. It was pretty standard, and in fact, so standard that a lot of the mainstream banks got very annoyed with building and loans, especially because building and loans were offering much more by way of interest. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But the thing about a building and loan is I talk about depositors throughout my book. Everybody who writes about building and loans do. But as one astute lawyer said, it was actually one of the receivers for the building and loan that my grandfather ran in 1932, he said, to a group of angry depositors, he said, you think you are depositors. You're not depositors. You're investors. This isn't your savings. You basically took a risk. You put your money in here, and you can't just pull it out. And you couldn't. I mean, it was standard boilerplate language, and you know this if you've seen It's a Wonderful Life. There was a waiting period, 3 to 6 months, and you couldn't get all of that money out sometimes at once even then. And it depended on what the deposit situation looked like, because this was all predicated upon an earlier model of B&L, these democratically run small little, almost movement businesses, right? Now, the building and loans in Colorado Springs and elsewhere failed for a number of reasons, including fraud. And the corruption is fascinating. At the time, if you look at newspapers from about 1930 on, you will find, and it doesn't have to be just Colorado Springs, you can find newspaper articles about what was happening in this industry and read about charges of embezzlement being brought against these operators. But for a variety of reasons, this history has not made it into the history books. Standard histories of the thrift industry really do not tell this chilling chapter in the history of building and loans. And that's what I do in my book. And instead, even to this day, I mean, one of the books that I consulted as I was finishing up work on this book was published, I think, in about 2015, referred to building and loans as banks with a soul. So this is a kind of dominant understanding of them, and one of the reasons is that a number, at least 2 of the often referred to go-to histories of the building and loan business were produced by people who were associated with that industry's powerful trade league, exerted a very powerful influence. Now, this trunk, Louis Vuitton trunk, very similar to the one that sat in my parents' basement, unlocked, but I never opened it the whole time that I would sit downstairs in the basement of our house and, I don't know, play Motown records and Rolling Stone records and whatnot, and it was just like, 15 feet away, and I never thought to open it. And had I would have found some stuff related to the scandal, because this was my first real first real exposure to documents related to the scandal. And the thing of it is, family history is often understood. I mean, I'm a professional historian. I teach at USC, right? But I know that within my field and within the field of professional history more generally, family history doesn't really get much respect. It's seen as history light, L-I-T-E, as one scholar puts it. Somebody who's actually very critical of it. It's the author Alison Light, who wrote a great book, she's British, about her own family called Common People, which I would recommend. It's quite amazing. But family history tends to be caricatured as narcissistic and, navel-gazing. But actually, I could not have uncovered what I uncovered without having a familial connection to it. And I think it would have been very hard for anybody to uncover because this history is buried in state archives, places where the archivists really don't want to see you. They want to see the lawyer who's come in and wants records on the divorce of Brown v. Brown in, 1968 or something, or the death record of their parent. They don't want to see me, who says, can you pull boxes, and then you give them a list of 15 boxes. Going and researching it in a state archive is a lot of hard work, and to really do a history that would be a thoroughgoing history of the B&L industry would mean going to a lot of state archives. I went to a couple. So family history was really, really important here. And again, what I found in Colorado Springs, that the extent to which fraud was implicated in failure was not uncommon. You look at Los Angeles, there was a very well-known big association there called Hollywood Guarantee. Hollywood stars, film people used it quite a lot, and it was run by a guy named Gilbert Biesemeyer. And in '31, it was discovered he had an $8.5 million shortfall. 8.5. It makes, my grandfather seem like, a drop in the bucket. And, there were similar failures, nothing on that scale, but there were failures in Philly and Chicago and Pittsburgh and New Jersey and more, Texas. Fraud, definitely a component in some cases. And then another big problem for building and loans was, building and loans dealt in property. And what happens in the Depression to market values? They plummet, right? And so, what had been worth, let's say, 10,000 is now, let's say, worth maybe 3 if you can even sell it. And that was a big problem in Pueblo. They had a mega association in Pueblo, and when that one collapsed, the receivers flooded the market with all of this property, and none of it sold. Here in Colorado Springs, they handled it differently and better. But in any case, what you should know is that nearly 50% of all B&Ls failed between 29 and about 41. That's pretty significant. Now, I will circle back around to the story of my grandfather, but I want to take up where this all starts. The beginning of the unraveling of the building and loan business in Colorado Springs. It's just before the new year of 1932. That is a year before the capture of my grandfather, who's, in Colorado Springs. He doesn't yet know, I think, how bad things are going to get. And there's a man who runs another building and loan. His name is Willis Sims. He's a lodge man. He's briefly a state legislator. He led the 4-Minute Man campaign during World War I. He had led the Chamber of Commerce. With his brother, he operated a very successful credit reporting agency. An agency that let businesses know who was credit worthy and who wasn't. And then he moved into banking. And by '31, he was running the State Savings Bank and the Assurance Savings and Loan, located in the State Bank building, now Kimball's Peak 3 movie theater on Pikes Peak. Of all the local B&L men, Willis Sims was the man whose reputation as a pillar of the community and an honest banker was absolutely rock solid, unassailable, to all appearances. But Sims overreached in 1921 when he entered into a development scheme with a former mayor of Manitou. The development, called Lennon Park, does that ring a bell? Turned out to be less lucrative than expected. It was right up against Garden of the Gods. You know, it's not that far from here. To salvage his investment, Sims took some of the land meant for individual lots and built, oh, I don't want that one. What happened? You know what, I think, I think I have the wrong one. It seems to be a mishmash. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can talk if you can open
Sure.
the other one, because I would love to get these images up. This one, it's confusing because they have very similar, so it's the one above, I guess. It didn't do that for me. Well, I will keep talking. Okay, so he overreaches. He gets involved with this former mayor of Manitou in Lennon Park, and he takes lots that aren't selling, and he opens up the Buffalo Lodge. Right, still in existence, and now it's actually doing much, much better. I remember when I was working on the book, there was a kind of seedy murder that happened there that I know got a fair amount of attention. But he opens up the Buffalo Lodge, but the thing it was meant to capitalize on the popularity of Colorado Springs as a tourist destination. But by the time it opens up, the depression is deep. It turns out not to be a very good move. And it turns out that he also is spending a lot of, it's a luxury lodge. And he takes out all of these loans to pay the bills for the lodge. And then he begins taking funds, apparently, from the accounts of some of his depositors. And this includes, if the court records are right, the allegations there, his brother and his mother, and applying them to his own account. He gets desperate. He wants to, he doesn't want to default on all the money that he owes, and begins juggling money between the bank and the B&L. On December 28th, 32, yes.
Is this the right slide, sir?
No.
No?
No. But the Ku Klux Klan was big here.
Yes.
It was. And I write about it in the book because it's, well, and I'm going to mention it again in a minute. So what happens is, December 28th, 32, he borrows $543 of state savings funds in order to pay his savings and loan customers the money he would owe them on their certificates of deposit come the new year. A businessman who made his name, Willis Sims, evaluating other people's credit worthiness, right? He knew, of course, he could not stave off financial disaster forever, right? That was his business. He knew, you have to evaluate people, right? So later that evening, December 28th, when he was trying to juggle these funds, make it all work, in the aftermath of Sims's suicide, the authorities and the local press assured residents that everything was fine. Willis Sims' business, it had nothing to do with his business. You know, yeah, he committed suicide, but God knows why. It had nothing to do with his business. Some months later, the local DA, a guy named Clyde Sterrett, said that as soon as Sims had fired the shot that killed him, the B&L commissioner for the state of Colorado should have gone to every single building and loan in this town and seen what they really had, what they actually had by way of cash and bonds. Instead, the B&L industry was allowed to slowly cater. Now, the thing of it is, the depositors, however, even if the newspapers were saying everything's fine, the depositors were not buying it. Today you would say it was fake news, right? They thought it was fake news. They were convinced that Sims's suicide revealed the financial precariousness of the B&L business in Colorado Springs. And they immediately start lining up in front of the associations where they have their money because they want to pull their money, but they can't get it out for the reasons that I said. In fact, my grandfather was accosted by an Italian-American woman who with her husband tried to kidnap him. He pays them some money and they leave him alone. The next character in this is a guy named Willis Sims. I'm sorry, named Ed Scherer. And Ed Scherer ran a building and loan called The Dollar. And he's an interesting guy. He had a law degree from a very reputable law school in Chicago. He moved here to be the lawyer for a mining magnate named J.R. McKinney. Has anybody ever heard of J.R. McKinney? Very, very powerful at one point in time. And so he's going to be his private secretary. And J.R. McKinney, like so many wealthy capitalists who made their money in gold mining in Cripple Creek, was moving
KKK, they were very strongly anti-KKK. He runs a little association, which he manages to run totally into the ground, but his depositors don't know that. And what we come to learn, once his association fails, is that he would routinely make notations of transactions on mere scraps of paper. Mere scraps of paper that he would then stuff into the cubby holes of his desk. That's how he did business. In June of '32, when he announced he was throwing his association into receivership, and his association had the very phony name of Home Building Club, he pledged that he would pay back every nickel that he owed his depositors. And at first he said, this is not about my wrongdoing, not at all. But when the authorities arrest him, he admits that he embezzled from his B&O in order to buy a ranch. And for that ranch, cattle, machinery, and that's not all, equity and an Oklahoma property too. The receiver, whose job it was to sort out the books of the home, was completely unprepared for what he found. For starters, 35 accounts totaling over $66,000 were nowhere on the books. You couldn't find them. Ultimately, the shortfall reached $100,000, and Bentall initially disputed that figure. And he said to the press, it is difficult to understand, and here he's complaining, it's difficult to understand how that much could slip through your fingers without you're receiving something for it. No, there was that ranch, there was that equity in the Oklahoma property, but whatever. That really angered the authorities. And because he had acquired a lot with other people's money, his petulance just did not go down well. The authorities sentenced him to between 16 and 35 years in the state pen. It's a pretty substantial sentence. That June, just as the news of the home B&O hit the papers, residents learned that their town's largest association, the city, had filed for receivership too. Now, the city was owned and operated by my grandfather, a man who, as I said,
I don't know if I said this actually. He was the son of, he was from a family of farmers turned barbers, and a man who wanted to be very, very, very rich. And he was a man who many residents here assumed was a financial genius, and not just because of his conspicuous consumption. And he did consume. I mean, he had fancy cars. He did a lot to sort of parade his wealth. He owned lots of valuable property in the city, including the prize corner of Tejon and Bijou. Once his business failed, though, residents would come to agree with a journalist, and this was a journalist who didn't even live in town, who called him Captain Nothing. Captain Nothing because he wasn't a captain of capital. Rather, he was a fraud, he was a fake, he was an imposter. He was a captain of nothing. He was Captain Nothing. In Colorado Springs, Walter Davis had pioneered the practice of offering inflated rates of interest to depositors. It was a rate, 6%, that wasn't tenable in the long run. And between 1920 and 32, he paid depositors, it was later figured out, $450,000 more in interest than their money was actually earning. He was running, effectively, a Ponzi scheme, robbing Peter to pay Paul, as the Colorado Springs Gazette put it. But by 22, he had pretty stiff competition from both Bentall and Scherer, who opened up shop and immediately began offering 7% interest. They were besting him. Davis likely also lost some business to customers at the Pueblo Mega Association, which tried to lure people from Colorado Springs as well. And the guys and the woman who were operating the railway B&L in Pueblo, that was a very contentious case. It took years and years to resolve, many years of appeals, overturned decisions. I mean, volumes and volumes, devoted to this case, and eventually they were prosecuted, although one of them died during that period. Of all the B&L men, though, Walter Davis was the most vilified because he did not play by the rules. In Colorado Springs, being a banker, even a fringe banker, usually meant playing the part of a civic, as you've seen, a civic-oriented pillar of the community. No matter how scandalous your own business practices might be or your personal life. But my grandfather didn't bother with any of that. He didn't bother joining lodges, going to church. He didn't go to church. On Sundays, he would be in Denver with his girlfriend, a woman who had worked as his stenographer and with whom he was involved for a decade. And he supported her to the tune of $350 a month. Now, the other thing you should know about my grandfather was that he was the second most insured man in Colorado. And this is a state with like lots of millionaires, right? Second most insured man. Interesting, right? And the insurance that he bought was universal life insurance. Anybody know what that means to have a universal life insurance policy? It means it pays out even in case of suicide. So he goes on the lam, and one of the first things he does is he calls his lawyer in Denver, and he says, I want you, because he has about $1 million in life insurance. Now, it turns out it ends up being about half that at the end of the day for a complicated sets of reasons. But he says, I want you to transfer all of those policies, all close to $1 million worth of policies from my wife to my depositors. I want her to get $100,000. I suspect he did that because he knew by that point how angry the depositors were and that they were mobilizing. And his own daughter had been threatened with kidnapping, that's my mother, in order to force him back. And this happened pretty quickly into his being on the lam. And he probably knew that, in a sense, engaging in a kind of preemptive restitution would make life easier for his remaining family members. And I suspect that the insurance money figured very much in his decision, his first night in jail. Because his first night in jail, in December of 1932, he takes his tie. It's a very expensive tie. It's a silk tie. And he takes his tie. There's nobody else in the cell with him. And he strangles himself. I would say he hung himself, except that there was only about that much distance between his shoes, the bottom of his shoes, and the cell floor. So he had to really work to kill himself. And by the time they discover this, they work and work and work on him. But like Willis Sims, he is gone. He is gone. And, one of the things that I talk about at length in the book is because the story doesn't end with his suicide. I mean, far from it, because there's huge wrangles, legal wrangles about the insurance money. And then, in the interim, after having been scammed by these B&L men, many depositors are desperate, and they're lured into handing over their passbooks to shady operators who knock on their door and say, ma'am, were you a depositor in City Savings? Yes, I was. Terrible what happened to you. Just terrible. My sympathies to you was terrible, but we have a solution. And we can relieve you of this. We can get you some money because you're obviously hurting. We can get you some money. They did this to all kinds of people. They did it to people who lived on the North End. In other words, they did it to middle-class people who were hurting, but who had once had some money. They did it to a court reporter at who worked for the judge handling these cases. I mean, a lot of people were duped. And they would say things like, hey, there's this great gold mining company, and we're going to sell you, 50 shares of stock in this company. Of course, they never see a penny. And so there's huge battle about what's going to happen there. And it slows down the whole process of being able to actually pay people some of the money that they're in fact owed. But the thing of it is, this happened across the nation. In California, it was such a big problem that depositors got together politically and pushed the legislature to try to pass a bill to stop that from happening. But it was happening in a lot of places. There's a great chronicle of the Depression called The Depression Diary by a guy named Roth. I think it was Benjamin Roth. It's a great diary. He was practicing law, I believe it was in Akron, and he writes about it in his memories he kept a diary and he writes about this. So why does the story matter? I would say it matters because it punctures, for one, the myth that the B&L business in the 20th century was essentially honest, that it was, in fact, these were banks with a soul. But it is more than that. The story I tell also calls into question Americans' routine idealization of Main Street business as the exemplar of all that is good about American capitalism. The Colorado Springs B&Ls I write about, again, all of them Main Street businesses, with the sort of face-to-face contact that depositors assume would mitigate fraud. It didn't, even though these people knew one another very, very often and quite well. In the Springs and elsewhere during the Depression, people were exploited sometimes by their neighbors, sometimes not just by far away, big-time Wall Street financiers. So in this book, I decenter the usual villain, Wall Street, and again, call into question this sort of knee-jerk idealization of Main Street. And I think it's still very much with us. There was a moment in the Democratic primary when there was a debate between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and one of the people in the press says to Bernie Sanders, "Are you really a socialist?" As though this is the most incredible thing. And it is kind of incredible, for those of us who lived through the Cold War, right? And he says, "Well, I'm against casino capitalism." And they turn to Hillary, and she says, "Well, I think it's, yes, basically I'm against that too, but I think it's really important to focus on Main Street. Main Street is different. Main Street is honest, and it's transparent, and it's innovative, and all of these things." And so I would just argue this is still with us, and I think that we need to think about the way in which all of us, to some extent, I think, or many of us, continue to see Main Street as a kind of site of redemption. We know Wall Street's funky and greedy, but there's a part of us that sort of needs to think that Main Street is different. The other thing that's important about it is that it's important to know your past. Forgetting really matters, and it really mattered in this instance. We forgot the reasons for the regulatory safeguards of the thrift industry that were put into place after its failure, put into place in the 30s. We forgot the reasons for Glass-Steagall. And more recently, we forgot the S&L crisis. And again, forgetting has consequences. And here's an example. Had the history of the B&L industry in these years, in the Depression years, been fully chronicled, I think it's possible that the 1980s deregulation of the savings and loan industry might have been carried out a little less recklessly. I wonder if it would have really included the ditching of 50-year-old safeguards, which were mischaracterized as anachronistic and unnecessary, a move that created the conditions for the collective embezzlement that was business as usual in the deregulated S&L industry. Some pundits have even suggested that the government's S&L bailout, which cost taxpayers at least $150 billion, established a precedent for government-subsidized recklessness, one that was then seized upon by pioneers of the risky subprime mortgage market, which played an outsized role, obviously, in the recent Great Recession. Finally, I would say, Shortfall is a book that is in many ways about property. Another really useful book, I would just give this a plug, is a book by Beryl Satter, S-A-T-T-E-R, it's called Family Properties, and she does something very similar to what Beryl Satter does, which she looks at the dual housing market, real estate market in Chicago, dual in the sense that there was a market for blacks and for whites. But property, this is a book in many ways that is about property, specifically home ownership. And owning a home can be a lifesaver for many people. Most of us who have homes and we've been in them a while and it's worked out, it can feel like a lifesaver. It's a refuge. You love to come home. But they can be risky business, as they were in 2008. When people with very bad credit got mortgages and were encouraged to get mortgages. I remember I was given a mortgage there was actually no way that I could afford in 2003. And luckily my life changed in very significant ways and I was able to afford it, but no way I should have been given a mortgage, I'll tell you. And not because I had a bad credit rating, but for other reasons. But this sort of activity happened in the 19th century too. And especially for the working classes, home ownership was a very risky proposition, especially as many poor men's banks of the sort that I talked about at the beginning, those real authentic B&Ls became instead for-profit corporations. By 1900, consider this, the foreclosure rate for Chicago's working people stood at a full 50%. Which suggests that, as a couple of historians have said, that Upton Sinclair got it right in his novel, The Jungle. Something else may have happened as well. And this is something that I can't nail, I can't prove, but I think that buying a house was less likely to be a community endeavor supported by one's neighbors as it had been when B&Ls were part of the fabric of the country's cooperative movement, at least in those places where it was. Instead, home ownership became an individual achievement that took plucky individualism, not a village, to achieve. And by the time we get to the 30s, with rising taxes in the 20s and the Depression, you have circumstances that begin to orient many homeowners, even those of the white working classes, more to the right. And because one of the things I discovered in this research was the extent to which there was a very active taxpayers league here in Colorado Springs and in Colorado and throughout the country in the early 30s. It looked like that was going to be the movement, not the union movement, but the taxpayers leagues. And so for many white working class people, their homes were their safety net. Safety net in the sense that they could self-provision. What do I mean by that? They could keep chickens. They could grow vegetables. They could rent out space to boarders. And for them, in government, which is getting bigger, and taxes, which are funding it and becoming more difficult for them to pay, are profoundly threatening, and they are worried about losing their homes. Shoot ahead to later in the 20th century, as homes came to be a family's biggest investment. That wasn't true in the 19th century. By the time most people could afford to buy a house, let's say in the mid-19th century, they were old. By the time, it's very, very different now. Now, you try to buy it when you're young, and it's the major investment that you have. And as that happened, anything that would threaten that investment, such as taxes or fair housing, and by fair housing, I mean housing that would get rid of housing covenants that would prohibit people of color and some other groups from buying into your neighborhood, all that would end up in the crosshairs of a new wave of taxpayers leagues in the 1970s and beyond, and into our own time. And I needn't talk to you guys in Colorado about that, Tabor, right? So I think that the recurring undermining of the B&Ls that I studied may have actually affected our political culture as anxious homeowners moved towards small government, and even the white working classes, some of them began to move in a direction that should make the current sort of more decisive move to conservatism look as though it has a longer history. And I will leave you with that to ponder, and I'm quite open to answering questions. Thank you.
So we have quite a bit of time for questions. If folks want to ask Dr. Echols, you can go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, is there any data on how many of the B&Ls that failed where the fraud actually played a role?
No, you have to go through. I mean, you would really, this is.
Because that's the question I'm wondering. Maybe what happened here is the exception, but elsewhere, So
Well, look at Gilbert Biesemeyer.
Right.
And then there are cases involving other big mega associations. So it happens at the small level. Like you get these reports of, the owner of a little B&L in New Jersey who turns on the gas and kills himself because he's been engaged in fraud. You have the case of Gilbert Biesemeyer. You have the case of Union Pacific, where it's in and out of courts for years and years and years, and all kinds of unsavory and what should be illegal activity has occurred. But what makes it very difficult to answer your question, because you would think, well, can't we just know this? But here's the problem. The laws governing B&Ls featured so much gray area. And that's why with the Pueblo case, the railway case, oh my goodness, they get convicted. That gets overturned. It goes back. The boxes that were generated for that case was huge because there was so much uncertainty because the law wasn't well written and it wasn't well developed and it was hard to know what constituted fraud. Making false reports. You would think making false reports would be illegal, right? When the B&L commissioner knocks on your door and says, we need reports. What's your annual report? And you give them a false report. You would think that would be illegal, wouldn't you? The Colorado Springs Gazette thought it was illegal. The depositors thought it was illegal. A lot of the lawyers thought it was illegal. Guess what? It wasn't illegal. So that's one problem in ascertaining. Because from our standpoint, there are a ton of fraudulent activities. What does it mean to give yourself a salary way out of proportion to what you should be paying yourself? What does it mean to give yourself bonuses? Again, that was deemed illegal. That was what happened in Puebla. Back and forth and back and forth. The other thing is, building and loans, I said that they failed, but they didn't really fail. Things happen. They get frozen. And then sometimes they become consolidated with another building and loan. And sometimes this just goes on. They're in a kind of fugue state for a long time. But you would have to actually go through very systematically the one person who has done this, and I'm happy to send you the citation, but you can find it in my book, is an economic historian who puts the failure rate at 50%, but never really touches the question of fraud. I mean, I hate to say it, one of the few people, I'm kind of the first person to really put this out. And I got there because of this family connection, but also because there's a very famous historian of the 1930s and the 50s called Elizabeth Cohen. She teaches at Harvard. And she wrote a book, Making a New Deal, about the 1930s. And she was studying Chicago, and she was looking at what happened to community-based institutions, mutual aid societies, right? Funeral associations, and building and loans. And what she discovered was a very high failure rate that was rooted in fraud. These were people who were considered to be the leaders of their community, and they took advantage of their communities. And one of the things that happened as a result was that, for instance, in certain communities, it began to fray the kind of intra-class unity, and they began to look more favorably upon the government. And so Cohen writes about that. But she was one of the few people who sort of made me think, I might be onto something. And then when I looked at the newspapers, it was clear that at least the newspapers think that there was shady and illegal activity happening. But again, if it's not against the law, was true of banking across the board, you know. The major reformer of banking said something very, very similar about all of the gray area. And it makes it very hard to figure out. But I think you'd have to go state by state and really see what was going on. But it's a very good question, but it's very hard to answer. And a lot of that is in the footnotes of my book. Yeah.
Could you tell me what you used as your primary sources and back in the 20s and 30s? Did you go to bankruptcy documents, receivership? I ask that because my father filed for bankruptcy here in 1929, and I never knew the circumstances around that.
Did he have a bank or was it a business?
Yeah, the Chevrolet dealership.
A Chevrolet dealership. Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Because Sims's brother was in the car business too. You'd have to send me an email and I'd have to get back to you
Okay.
about that. But no, okay, so the Gazette was a primary source, but also there were a bunch of different newspapers operating. There was the Colorado Springs Independent on the west side, which was the Klan outlet that was the mouthpiece of the Klan when the Klan was active here. There was also this really interesting one, very right-wing in certain respects, but not all, called Common Sense Weekly.
Yeah.
And they only had, thank God for Tim Blevins in the Pikes Peak Library. It was amazing, yes, amazing man. And he found me several copies of it. That was very useful. But the thing that was the most useful were really the court records. And then also the commissions that were set up. I mean, there was a commission set up by the governor to study what had happened. That was very useful. And then the auditor's records, which were annually produced.
Mm-hmm.
Usually annually produced. And so I consulted those two. All of that financial material.
One thing I'm sure I don't know that a lot of you in Colorado Springs know is the impact of sugar here. And right next door, the antlers with all the sugar that we, I worked as a government.
Oh, did you? Well,
10 cents an hour.
I bet. Well, the antlers figures in this.
Well, definitely.
Oh, yeah.
And where can I get a copy of the book? That's what you want to know.
Amazon. Well, actually, there's an independent bookstore owner here who has, I think, a warehouse. He has a mail order business.
On Clausen's?
Yes. And you can get an autographed copy from him.
I have a question. Now, in the 80s and then even later, there's been a lot of failure of the Savings and Loan Association.
Yeah, that's what I was
And-
talking about at the
Yeah.
very, very end. Yes.
Right, and that is understood to be a structural matter in the sense, in economics we typically explain it in terms of the long loans at low
Yes,
interest
exactly.
rates that you give out, whereas you have to give your depositors more.
Yes,
So it's,
exactly.
you're structurally
That's exactly
in
right.
a loss. So, but that kind of failure is not built upon individual cases of fraud as
Well, that
in
wasn't.
this story.
No, that isn't. You're absolutely right that there was a structural problem because people were able to get much more on their money. Because building and loans, here's the thing. Because building and loans had been paying out inflated rates of interests, when the federal government came in and the laws were rewritten for the savings and loan industry, they were barred from offering those inflated rates of interest, right? I think it was at 3 or 3.5%. It's very, very low. So cut ahead to like the 70s, people can get a lot more money, right?
Regulation Q.
Regulation Q. Well,
But the thing is that, they still failed. And then that sector failed back then. And then again we have failure but the institutions are all different.
Well, absolutely, they are different, but what I would say is that probably the savings and loan industry should have been allowed to fail as it stood, right? It would have been a loss, but it wouldn't have been a catastrophic $150 billion loss, because what happened was really casino capitalism at that point, when it was totally unregulated. And certainly the books that I consulted, and maybe there are other books that I didn't read that present a different approach to it, but the books that I consulted certainly suggested that yes, they were doomed to fail. They should have been allowed to fail, right? The fact that they were allowed to be resuscitated in the ways that they were by getting rid of regulation was not a smart thing, because at the end of the day, it cost us more. Yeah, but there are some really, I think, very good books that detail this.
I think your grandfather did something amazing by giving his insurance money. I don't know any thoughts that.
I think it's a really interesting case. I was talking to a lawyer whom I know who said, exactly the same thing. This is amazing, this kind of preemptive restitution. It may be the first such case. I've never heard of it.
I don't think Bernie Madoff did.
No. But
Doing time.
But it's very, very interesting. Read the book if you
I
have.
did.
You did? So do you think I'm too hard on it?
A little bit. I did. I think the other characters that you mentioned were, I don't know, worse frauds, more fraudulent. And your grandfather didn't pretend to be anything except what he was, it seemed to me. That's how I analyze it. He wanted to live the good life. He managed to cut through, from being very poor, no connections, to getting something that he wanted. He lived high on the hog. He had a wife. He had a mistress. He saved your grandmother
And her daughter.
And her daughter.
What's not to like?
What's not to like? And his bank didn't fail any worse than the other banks in town.
Well, it failed.
Except that he was more of a scandal because he had the mistress.
That's right. He had the mistress, right? And in Colorado Springs, that was not a good thing. But no, I think it's not what you say. It's not as though it hasn't occurred to me, and that's why I asked you if you thought I was too hard on it.
Yeah, I had ambivalent feelings more than you did.
Yeah, and I think that this is what can happen when you write family history, because I bent over backwards so that I wouldn't be seen as being apologetic. And I think that, you may be right.
And I thought you might have been too soft on your mother, or your grandmother.
I was too, yeah, okay, so, yeah, I liked her better.
I think she was maybe in cahoots with him.
Well, see, I didn't, well, we can talk about this. I didn't see the evidence. I wanted more evidence, and I really did think about that. And I did think, I've actually said this in another talk, maybe I was too hard on him, and maybe I should have been harder on her. It's very tough, because what you have, historians, what we have to deal with are fragments. We have fragments. That's to your question, and you never get the whole truth. You get as close to it, you try,
I got a lot.
I got a lot. And I'm not some postmodern historian who's, going to go that direction. But it is partial.
And, to your point too, I think banking is something that we just, in a cycle, keep getting wrong. And I'm afraid we're doing it again.
Yeah.
We're forgetting the lessons of 2008.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising that by 1980 we've forgotten the lesson.
Oh, yeah.
In keeping continuity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
How old was your mother when all this was happening?
She was in her mid-20s, and she was a law student at the University she really was very socially ambitious, and so the scandal really ruined her. And she ended up working at Edith Farnsworth's bookstore. She was her sort of right-hand woman, and she loved that. She loved doing that.
Who are the B&L businesses at Main Street today?
For the B&L, I don't know.
Yeah.
Wells
But-
Fargo.
Well, I'm also HBA.
I mean, it's really, I mean, the book is also about debt because he starts out as a loan shark. And that's one of the most interesting, I think, parts of it is that if the historians and sociologists whose work I consulted are right, one of the key differences between the loan shark business when my grandfather was doing it and what exists today is that my grandfather did not want deadbeats. You know, he checked people, he did not want deadbeats. He wanted to collect that loan. And now paper just gets sold. And they actually, according to some very reputable books and reputable historians and sociologists and economists, they actually find it profitable to deal in bad debt. And that's a really big difference. You know, and again, I thought that I sort of tried to humanize him a little bit there as like not the terrible loan shark. I think you had your head.
Oh, well, other people have touched on it. Regulations come and go. Do you see any end to that?
No, I mean, I think it's, I mean, what can we say? I mean, it's, I can't believe that there's so soon after 2008 that this is all being, that you know, that we're shutting this. It's quite concerning. Anybody over here? Yeah.
If the real estate market had not gone south in the 30s, what would have happened?
Well, I think, okay, I mean, I still think that my grandfather was living so high on the hog, and he was paying his depositors so much nearly $500,000 more than he could afford. I don't know how long that would have been sustainable. I just don't know.
How about the other building along?
You mean here?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, we've gone through the housing meltdown a couple times over the last few decades, and I'm wondering if there hadn't been a housing meltdown.
If
all
One of
markets
the
keep
four
going
failed.
up,
Yeah.
everything is rosy.
You know,
right?
if the jazz age had continued to, you know, rock,
Yeah.
it could have been a while, or maybe never.
Housing values kept going up.
But that doesn't happen, right? I mean, housing values go up, and then something happens. There's a correction, right? Isn't that what we call it? Correction. Yes.
Come a little closer, my voice is quite big. No. The first generation of BNLs was based on ethical, sort of human-oriented motivation that was later corrupted.
Mhm.
And more recently, there have been new experiments in small banking, like transnational personal microfinance, bringing
Exactly.
bank,
Perfect
keep a
example.
loan. If you apply your research or historical research to a modern context, how much risk do you see in that beginning globalized industry, and what kind of regulation would you foresee with the
Well, it's very interesting. I originally started out my book talking about microloans because it's so relevant. Because of what you just said. I mean, microloans, they start out as this endeavor to try to democratize finance and to help poorer people, right? But even even the person most responsible for sort of popularizing that has said that, sort of thrown up his hands and has admitted that basically they're moving in the direction of being loan sharks. So I think buy my book, it's somewhere there. But I think regulation is a very hard sell, especially in this particular moment. And because at the moment, who knows what's going to happen. But it's a very good question, and that connection between microloans and BNLs, very smart. Yeah, very smart.
Yeah, I have one more question. So Colorado Springs had a reputation for being a fairly well-heeled community. so probably compared to other communities of similar size, you'd have more people who at least consider themselves financially sophisticated at the time.
Yes.
So who were the people that were getting taken advantage of by people like your grandfather, and then how did they pull this off on them, considering the fact that they probably should have known better? I mean, seemed like, oh, we'll give you 6%, right? I mean, my guess is most of these people were competent at math, and so they probably should have been able to figure out, well, this is not going to pay off in the end.
You know how people are, though. You know, I mean, against their better judgment. I mean, all of the people who like me, it was like, oh, I qualify for a mortgage on this $500,000 house? Wow, that's great. You know? I mean, it's so seductive. The idea that your money would be earning like 2 points more than at, the state savings bank, right? I mean, we're just suckers for that. But there is a more complicated and, useful answer to your question, which is true. Colorado Springs, city of millionaires, right? And the millionaires, certainly, there were some very wealthy people who dealt with my grandfather, I know. Somebody wanted to trade a property on Millionaires Row with my grandfather. But they would have regarded him with great disdain as a fringe banker, not as the real thing. So, to answer your question, his original customers, when he's a loan shark, and Bento also starts out as a loan shark, and there's another guy who starts out as a loan shark and tries to transition into the BNL business. And why do they do this? Because loan sharking is getting to be more difficult. It's getting to be regulated, and they're disdained. Loan sharks are the worst of it, right? Ooh, right? There's also anti-Semitism attached to loan sharking. That's in the book too. So the original customers whom he has are in Colorado City. I mean, they're on the west side, right? He starts this in around the teens. Of course, it becomes incorporated by, 1917, I think? It becomes the west part of Colorado Springs. So they're working class. They're the people who work at the mills, right? And of course, there are fewer and fewer of them as we get farther into the teens and 20s. And then what begins to happen in the 1920s is many more middle-class people nationally begin to put their money into building loans because of the superior rates of return. And so you do have more middle-class people, and you do have a lot of widows and a lot of old people who, this is one of the cases that I discovered in my grandfather's file, was this elderly doctor, Dr. Woody, who, had a minder, a guy who was sort of minding him, but, it was clear that, I don't know how compos mentis this guy was, right? To take my grandfather's word when he says, hey, of course it's a bank, right? Without that much proof, apparently. So widows, the elderly, but middle-class people too. And as I said, this court reporter, he should have known, in theory, he should have known better. But, you're not finding the Penroses and the Tutts and, those people are certainly not investing in it. You're absolutely right. And there are a lot of people, I think, sort of upper middle class who wouldn't have invested with them either. Yeah.
Share one story. I'm old enough to remember building new loans when I was growing up. And I can remember taking my paperboy earnings and putting them into building a loan every week or every month in the 50s, back in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania era. But I still remember that it was insured. So my father could assure me, put your money in there, and it was fun to watch the interest grow.
Yes.
It was insured up to $100,000, and in the 30s, insurance didn't exist.
Well, it's an artifact of those New Deal years. It's an artifact of the reform, and so they did get insured at first, at not quite the level at which banks were insuring, but then it changed, and they upped the insurance. But that was one of the big innovations
lowering the acceptable rate of interest and then also offering insurance. Federal insurance was key. Because I'll tell you something, and this was something else that I went to the National Archives in Maryland, and I was looking at the records of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which refinanced some mortgages that were in trouble, and quite a few here in Colorado Springs. HOLC records are fascinating, and one of the things I discovered when I looked at the Colorado records was that even though the HOLC was refinancing mortgages for people, because they were still dealing with B&L people, the HOLC people were dealing with B&L people, there was a lot of suspicion of them. You know, they didn't trust them because they hated the building and loan industry, hated it. And there was a poll that was taken by somebody working in the Denver HOLC office. I don't know if you remember this because you've read the book, and he was asking people if they would invest in a building and loan. It was like, absolutely not. The trust of building and loans was so low. It took the federal insurance, it took those reforms, and it took a while for them to make themselves over. But they eventually did, and then they became a real engine of the economy until, of course, the economy changed. Yeah. Any more questions?
Thank you so much for coming out. If you did not grab any food, please take some food. Take some food home because the food services folks are going to come by in 20 minutes or something, and they're going to dump it all. So please take food home.
They don't really dump it, do they?
Students should take